Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly critical, meticulously detailed analysis of Bangladesh's 15-year liquefied natural gas, or LNG, commitment to the United States. This source material breaks down a seriously complex web of geopolitics, global energy markets, and high-stakes financial formulas, and it does it all by pointing a giant magnifying glass at a very specific, very tight timeline.
Right off the bat, the source text asks this fascinating, pointed question. How exactly did a frantic 3-day window lock an entire country into 15 years of incredibly expensive energy? It's a huge question about a rushed political decision. But, before we can even begin to get into the geopolitical drama of it all, we really need to understand the fundamental rules of the global energy game.
To make this super accessible, the author uses a brilliant mango buying analogy to explain how commodities like gas are purchased. Think of it like you have two options. The first is a spot market. This is simple, no contract. You go to the market today, you see a shortage of mangoes, and you just pay today's price, based purely on immediate supply and demand. The second option is a long-term contract. Here, you agree to buy mangoes for years into the future. But crucially, you aren't fixing today's price. You're agreeing to a future pricing formula, like saying you'll always pay $1 more than whatever the market average is on that future day. You are totally locked in, regardless of whether the whole market crashes or your own business slows down.
So, the absolute crucial point the source emphasizes is this. When you sign a long-term contract, the risk doesn't just magically disappear. It merely changes hands. The formula is set, and from the day you sign, your right to say no is completely gone. You have to buy that gas no matter what is happening to your national economy. The author argues that this one single concept is the absolute foundation for everything that went wrong here.
Now, to understand why Bangladesh was basically forced to the table to sign such a rigid agreement, we have to zoom out and look at the global context. The author points directly to a massive global supply squeeze, highlighting this staggering number, 1.28 crore, or 12.8 million. Iranian missile strikes on Qatar's Ras Laffan facility knocked out 1.28 crore tons of global LNG production capacity, literally almost overnight.
To see how fast this escalated into an international crisis, just look at the immediate fallout. That strike destroyed 17% of Qatar's export capacity. Qatar Energy estimated repairs would take 3 to 5 years, causing a $20 billion annual loss. They essentially had to declare force majeure, pulling a massive chunk of supply away from the rest of the world. With Qatar, which, by the way, supplies about 20% of the world's LNG, suddenly out of the picture, spot market prices skyrocketed. They doubled to $20 to $28 per unit. Desperate buyers around the globe were suddenly backed into a very tight corner.
And that brilliantly illustrates the author's next foundational point. This global crisis created a ruthless textbook seller's market. In a seller's market, the price isn't up for polite discussion. If you're a buyer who desperately needs gas to keep your country running, the seller dictates the terms and you just sign. As a buyer, you have absolutely zero leverage. Which brings us to the domestic actors involved. The source text heavily scrutinizes the unelected Ioannis interim government. Now, the author notes, impartially, that an interim government's primary mandate is typically just to hold a national election. Yet, in this environment of absolute zero leverage, they signed a 15-year reciprocal trade agreement with the United States. And this wasn't just for gas. It included commitments for Boeing aircraft, agricultural products, and LNG. The whole shebang totaled a staggering $15 billion commitment. Okay, the timeline the author pieces together here is absolutely wild. The LNG contract was signed on February 9th. Just 3 days later, on February 12th, the national election was held. And then, a major twist. On February 20th, the U.S. Supreme Court actually struck down the specific tariff threat that had allegedly been used to pressure Bangladesh into the agreement in the first place. So, the author raises a highly critical question regarding the competence and the true motives of the negotiators. Why didn't they just wait? If they had held out for just 11 more days, the legal threat forcing them to the table would have completely dissolved. Alternatively, why couldn't they wait a mere 3 days and let a newly elected government handle a massive commitment that lasts all the way until the year 2038? The source leaves these questions hanging over the entire negotiation process. Let's look at the real-world fallout. When the newly elected government took over, a lot of people demanded they scrap the deal entirely. But the author points out the cold, hard reality. With only a $32 billion usable reserve, ongoing IMF negotiations, and the U.S. sitting as their largest single export destination, tearing up the contract would devastate garment workers' salaries and the wider economy. They could really only review it. Then, disaster actually struck.
On July 21st, a fire at an American-owned Accelerate Energy terminal in Moheshgali immediately wiped 450 million cubic feet of gas per day right off the national grid. The resulting gas crisis was immense, crippling everything from household kitchens to major industrial power plants. Some claimed it was a conspiracy, but the source argues you don't even need a conspiracy theory for this to be a disaster. The real danger lies in structural vulnerability. When a rushed contract structurally eliminates all your alternatives, a simple routine accident, like a fire or a storm stopping a ship, becomes an automatic weapon of blackmail. The nation is essentially left begging at the negotiating table. To show exactly how punishing the structure is, the author meticulously breaks down one specific transaction born from that massive $15 billion commitment, the Gunvor deal. The government recently approved the purchase of 117 cargoes of LNG from the American company Gunvor USA, spanning from 2026 to 2038. At current market rates, we're talking about roughly $70 million per single ship. But the timing of these deliveries is fascinating. They are heavily backloaded. Only 17 cargoes arrive in the first 3 years, compared to a massive 103 cargoes scheduled between 2029 and 2038. So why? Well, the author explains that by 2029, new global LNG plants are expected to finally come online, which will likely drive global prices down. So the seller mathematically locked in their massive sales volume precisely when they know gas will be cheaper to source. It maximizes their own profit, while the buyer is trapped. Remember our mango analogy about long-term formulas? The author reveals the hidden math here, and it's absolutely crucial to understand. The contract for those 103 future ships does not have a fixed dollar amount per unit. Instead, the final bill is entirely tethered to the internal American gas market, specifically an index in Louisiana known as the Henry Hub. Okay, let's actually break down this pricing formula step by step to see how these costs pile up. The formula is 121% of the Henry Hub rate plus $5.20. First, you take the base American market rate. Second, you add a steep 21% markup, which covers the seller's profit and their own internal U.S. transportation costs. And finally, you tack on a massive, non-negotiable fixed fee of $5.20 per unit. That is just the processing fee to freeze the gas to minus 162 degrees so it can be shipped across the ocean. No matter how cheap gas gets in the U.S., Bangladesh has to pay that $5.20 fixed fee. Now, to be fair, the newly elected government did try to fight back. Comparing the offers side by side, the original U.S. offer was 122% plus $5.35. The new government actually managed to negotiate that down to 121% plus $5.20. Over 103 ships, that seemingly tiny reduction does save about $65 million total. However, the author points out a really harsh market reality here. A standard fair market global rate for long-term U.S. LNG is around 115% of the Henry Hub. Even after negotiations, the nation is locked in at 121%, meaning they're paying millions above the global standard. So why couldn't they just demand it get down to 115%? This quote from the source perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of the entire situation. Because at the table where you can't say no, you don't set the price. And the right to say no was sold on February 9th. The bad math isn't a failure of the current negotiators. It's simply the inevitable symptom of losing your leverage entirely. As we wrap up this explainer, the author leaves us staring at 4 critical, highly concerning unanswered questions. First, what mandate did a temporary interim government have to bind a nation to a 15-year energy obligation? Second, what was the rush to sign just 3 days before an election? Third, where was the transparency? When was the full text ever shown to the public or the parliament? And finally, how could the negotiating team be so completely blind to an impending U.S. court ruling that would have saved their bargaining position just 11 days later? Ultimately, this profound analysis forces us to look far beyond the immediate gas shortages and the technical pricing formulas. It challenges us to zoom out and ask a much harder question. What is the true long-term cost to a nation's sovereignty and its economic survival when its leaders sign away the fundamental right to choose its own alternatives? It's a chilling thought to leave you with, and one that absolutely demands further investigation.